This episode is brought to you by HASA. Liquid is clearly better. Liquid chlorine is the highest purity, works immediately, has no added cyanuric acid or calcium, and it will leave your pool safe, clean, and clear. And by the bottom feeder professional grade battery powered vacuum system. It sucks to clean pools, so cleaning pools sucks less. Get $100 off with code DVB100.
This episode is brought to you by Skimmer, the #1 pool service software in North America. With Skimmer, you can streamline your schedule, grow your revenue, and keep your customers coming back with 5-star service. Whether you're a one-person operation or an established team, Skimmer is your partner in success. Visit getskimmer.com/poolguy to try Skimmer for free for 30 days.
The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show.
Hi, welcome to the Pool Guy Podcast Show. In this episode, I'm going to go over some filter issues, starting with the catastrophic. Then I'm going to back down to some common issues. So I'll start with things that you definitely don't want to have happen to you out in the field with filters, and this could be actually life-threatening situations, to the very simple problems that go wrong with filters. Are you a pool service pro looking to take your business to the next level? Join the Pool Guy coaching program. Get expert advice, business tips, exclusive content, and get direct support. From me, I'm a 35-year veteran in the industry. Whether you're starting out or scaling up, I've got the tools to help you succeed. Learn more at swimmingpoollearning.com. The first one that is pretty catastrophic is a blockage anywhere in the return line, which causes the water not to leave the filter and go back into the pool. And of course, the danger point is when you turn on the system and the water doesn't go anywhere. And this has happened to me on 3 different occasions. I'll just share one of them with you. All of them were pretty scary. But this one happened when the builder had put in a water feature tied to the return jets. And the problem with this was it had a Jandy valve, and the customer had broken off the black safety tab on the bottom. So he was able to over-rotate the Jandy valve to where it actually turned the return flow completely off, if you can kind of picture that. And it was just impeccable timing, because if I wasn't there at that moment to turn the pool on that morning, chances are it would have blew up the filter eventually within a few minutes. And if someone was back there, it could have been a life-threatening situation. But I got to the stop, and I always turn on the pools, of course. You're supposed to turn them on when you service the pool. And I remember clearly, it was a Pentair Clean and Clear Plus. Turned on the pump with the timer. The pressure gauge went from 0 to like all the way to the end where it never goes. And then the filter lid actually was bulging. And I quickly, just out of reflex, flipped the timer off like instantly. And I think the pool was on for maybe 1 or 2 seconds at the most, maybe 2 seconds. And I thought if this thing was on any longer than that, it would have exploded, because the pressure in that tank with that clamp. And the other good news is I cleaned these filters myself. So when I put the clamps on with the compression nuts, I really go crazy. I make sure that there's no gaps at all in that compression nut at all. And they're on super tight. And that's probably what saved me, was that I actually maintained the filters, and I have a habit of putting those clamps on extremely tight. Now, I know the little drawing on the side shows like the filter lid popping off when you're putting on the clamp and the compression nut. Something that doesn't happen very often. So be careful that also when you're doing that, kind of putting a lid back on the filter. If you don't have things in place, that could build up pressure at that point when you're just putting that clamp on, and then that top lid will blow off. So it's kind of the same effect in that instance, but the blockage is of course much more dangerous, because when you're cleaning the filter, you can take precautions like taking the pump lid off, which I recommend. If you do filter cleanings, teach your employees to take the pump lid off as well, and then put the filter lid back on and put the pump lid on after that. And you'll never have to worry about the filter coming on when you forget to turn off the breaker or turn off the timer, because the pump lid is open and it just won't prime up. So you're pretty safe there. But a blockage is definitely very dangerous, and it could happen in different situations. I had another one where a heater part broke off and was lodged in there. And then another incident where, I can't say that word. The salt cell was clogged up with cypress leaves. So the cypress trees by a pool are bad to begin with. They're not my favorite tree anyway. I guess it's a tree. It's not a bush. It looks like a bush in some cases, but it's a tree. And the cypress droppings are pretty thick, but at the same time, they're thin enough sometimes to get into the pump basket, through the skimmer basket, through the impeller, into the filter. And sometimes when you're cleaning the filter, which when this happened, I wasn't too careful, and some of them went into the return line. And over time, they clogged up the salt cell to the point where it was a very similar blockage, but almost not a complete blockage, but still a very dangerous situation. So various things can cause the blockage in the return line. Just be aware of that. There's nothing you can really do unless you're like really paranoid, and before you turn on a pool, you're like looking at all the valves and checking everything. It's just something that you should be aware of, because this could happen to you as well, and it's a very dangerous situation. Next on the list is a cracked filter. Now, this in itself sometimes is not dangerous because the crack takes time to expand, but it could start with like a little pinhole where you just see a little bit of water shooting out the size of a pinhole, basically. Then you get there next week and the crack has expanded to maybe a size of, a staple, and it's shooting out of that little thing. And then you get there another week and it's the size of a quarter. Eventually, that lid's going to split and explode water out of the side of it. So I haven't had one where it actually took the top off of it. It just shoots out a good amount of water pretty rapidly, draining down the pool. So you definitely want to address any cracks in the filter by simply replacing the top part or the bottom part. You can't really patch these things because it's under tremendous pressure and it's not going to hold. And so replacing the lid or the bottom is important. One thing to note, sometimes when you go to replace the lid of the filter, this happened to me a couple times, it doesn't really match the bottom perfectly. I'm not sure if this is because they're molded as one unit or maybe different runs of them are just slightly different. So if you do get a new top part, it may not be 100% perfectly matched to the bottom part. So just be aware of that. And sometimes recommending a whole new filter is the way to go in that case. So that's something else that you're going to run into. You'll see a little crack in the filter, a pinhole, but within a short period of time, no one knows exactly how long you have. Could be a few days to a couple weeks. That pinhole is going to expand to a full-blown gusher of water at the side. And the Pool Guy Podcast Show has teamed up with UPA to bring you affordable, reliable liability insurance starting at just $64 a month. Get up to $2 million in coverage, and the members of my coaching group get an even lower rate. Protect your business and your peace of mind. Sign up with UPA today by clicking the link in the podcast description. The filter. Another common issue you're going to run into is back pressure. This is where it's not really a dangerous situation per se, but you notice that the pressure gauge is running a lot higher than your other pool accounts. Let me unpack this a little bit. This could be because of the plumbing, but it's very similar to, let's say you have a pool, and this happens sometimes where you put it in spa mode. In pool mode, let's just say you have a single speed pump, to keep it simple here, or you have a VS pump at a high RPM. And so when you're in pool mode, you're at 20 PSI. But as soon as you change it over to spa mode, you're at like 27 or 28 PSI. And that's some back pressure in certain situations from the spa plumbing, because you have some restriction on the jets to get that power. So you have smaller return lines in the spa typically. And so that creates back pressure automatically when you go from pool to spa in some cases. Not every time, but in some cases it does. So very much like that, if you have a pool and maybe it has some kind of weird plumbing, and this happens, the builder puts something in, it's older sometimes, and in most of your accounts, when you have a D filter, you're at 20 PSI, but at this particular account, you're at 25 PSI at a clean filter, and that's because there's some back pressure. That means that the pump is pulling water faster than the filter can return it to the return lines to the pool. Could be caused by, again, just kind of funky plumbing from the builder, or it could be caused by something like a Polaris 360. This is the pressure side, return side cleaner, and this is going to take one of the return jets. You also may run into this if you have any restrictors on the jets. Sometimes when you put a device on like the pool skim, for example, which is a great device for leaf debris on the surface, by the way, you have to restrict the jet maybe with a smaller eyeball or even close off a return jet altogether to get the pool skim to activate at the right speed. And same with the Polaris 360. You may have to plug a jet or restrict a jet, and this causes some back pressure in the filter. Again, not dangerous, but something to be aware of, that a certain amount of back pressure is acceptable. And to a point, if it gets too high, then you're going to have to do some kind of different adjustments with the Polaris 360, or you're going to have to figure out what's causing the back pressure and maybe alleviate that by replumbing some of the return of the pool. And it could also be a dirty salt cell. I mentioned that you can have a complete blockage, which happened to me, but you can also have partial blockage with a lot of calcium buildup in the salt cell. So take those off and inspect them, because sometimes that's causing the back pressure in the pool. But that's also something that's kind of common out there, and you'll run into it. The more accounts you get, you're going to eventually run into that. The next problem you're going to have that is kind of rare, but it does happen still, is when someone plumbs in a cartridge filter the same way you would plumb in a D filter or vice versa. So if you look at the D filter, you'll notice that the inlet and outlet are reversed compared to a cartridge filter and a sand filter. And this is important because if you plumb it in wrong, you're going to have the inlet, which is the suction, going to the return part of the filter, and then the outlet is going into the inlet part of the filter. And this causes all kinds of problems, of course. And you'll notice right away that the water quality of the pool is really poor. And if you take the lid off the filter, you'll notice that only about half the cartridges have dirt on them, and the other half are like totally brand new. And that has a lot to do with having this problem. Now, a secondary problem would also be that you don't have enough water going into the filter. Maybe you're running your VS pump at 1800 RPMs and it doesn't really push it up to the top if there's a lot of air in the filter. That could be a secondary problem as well. But in most cases, when it's plumbed in wrong, inlet and outlet are reversed, you're going to have a lot of problems with that filter. Now, if you go from a standard D filter to the quad D filter, also note that the quad D filter has the same inlet and outlet of a cartridge filter, so that has to be reversed as well. I once was back there when there was a home inspector, and he was looking at the filter, and he was like, "Oh, I can't figure out what kind of filter this is. Is it a cartridge or DE filter?" And, there was no backwash valve on there, which is kind of weird, but it does happen sometimes. They'll put a DE filter in with no backwash valve, and I knew that I didn't have one because the customer had one put in without it. And I told them, well, the easiest way to tell, of course, is a backwash valve, and if that's not there, the DE filter, the outlet is on top, and the inlet is on the bottom. And if it's a cartridge filter, it's going to be reversed. The inlet will be on top and the outlet will be on the bottom. So you can see how this would cause a problem with a pool if you have these two reversed. The other problems you're going to run into is with the pressure gauge on top. Now, I've talked about this before. A lot of times you have to just kind of tap the gauge if they get older to get the PSI correct. Sometimes it gets sticky, the needle. Easiest thing to do is replace the gauge. The top part of the gauge is not that expensive, like $6 or $7 for a new pressure gauge. Put it on there, that'll solve that problem. But you should have a gauge that's operational so you know what the pressure is, especially in a D filter, to know when you have to backwash that filter. So make sure that if you have an older gauge that's kind of sticky, that you tap it. If you notice that when you turn it off, it still shows 10 PSI, obviously that gauge is sticking and it's not going down to 0 at that point. Other problems, the air bleeder could be a problem. You could have water leaking from them. I find this on the very old ones, like the Pentair 2000 series filters. They'll have like a little drip coming out of there and you can't seal it. I've done some crazy things like take a twig from a tree or a bush and I've stuck it in there to kind of stop it from leaking. That was somewhat effective. And then, of course, I've had a Pentair air bleeder that was leaking and I didn't have a spare one on my truck. And so I just stuck some duct tape in there to stop it, and it was pretty effective. So sometimes that air bleeder relief will just leak water out, and of course have some spare parts. And if not, just kind of turn in the MacGyver and kind of jerry rig something that's going to stop the water from leaking so you're not losing too much water before you can get that pressure gauge, the air relief replaced. Let me touch on the clamps here for a minute. Now, Hayward had a bad run of these really bad clamps. They're not bad as far as functioning and mechanically wise, they worked fine, but they got corroded really fast. So after like a year or two, it looks like the filter clamp came from the Titanic. That's how bad the buildup was, and it was just because they used substandard material, and they fixed that in the newer filters. But you may have a run of a lot of Hayward filters out there on your route that have a clamp on there that's maybe like 3 or 4 years old, but it looks like it's like 50 years old. It's still perfectly operational. It just looks ugly. And then of course Pentair, their clamps are pretty robust and long lasting. One thing I've said before is that you need to really lube up the threaded bolt that's on there that's attached to the clamp. And the way I lube it up is with some magic lube. It actually fits right into the top of the magic lube tube, and you can pull it out, and that's lubed up pretty well. And then you can get the nut on there, and that keeps it from getting stripped a little bit. So what happens when these bolts get stripped, it's really hard to get them off because you're taking some metal shards and you're not really threaded in there properly, and getting it off can take you like 10 minutes. And I would not recommend putting it back on, by the way, because that'll take you another 30 minutes to put it back on. The best thing you can do is replace the clamp at that point, because that doesn't come off. It's like welded onto the clamp for a very good reason, a part that wears out. And sometimes you can get a new spring barrel nut and put it on there, and it goes on nice and easy. So you can do one or two things: replace the clamp, and the other thing you can do is try to get a brand new spring barrel nut and put it on there. Sometimes that actually works, and you can get away with it for another filter cleaning. But yeah, that's a real nightmare when those things are on there and they're kind of, the bolts on there wrong, and you're just trying to get the nuts on there wrong, and it's kind of stuck onto the bolt wrong, and it's not threaded in there properly, and it just takes you forever to get that off of there. But that's one thing that happens with the Pentair ones. And make sure, like I mentioned at the beginning, that spring barrel nut, there's a picture on that clamp that shows you that there should be no gaps at all. So make sure you tighten that thing up so there's 0 gaps in that spring, and that could save you one day if you have a filter that comes on where there's a blockage, because that's going to hold that lid on really tight without bursting it off. So definitely make sure you put that on tight. And a little plug here, I recommend using the multi-torque socket set. It gets those clamps on and off very easily, unless they're stripped, of course, and you have to use a regular socket wrench that takes forever. And it's a great time saver, so check out the multi-torque at multi-torque.com and get those. They're for all the filter clamps, and you're going to be amazed at how fast you can get them on and off with a cordless drill. And the last thing I'll cover here is a leaking tank O-ring. So what happens, or actually a leaking tank, when you put the clamp back on, and that's usually indicating that the O-ring is worn out. So one thing you need to do is make sure you have spare O-rings. And one thing that I suggest is using silicone spray whenever you clean the filter. Spray that on the O-ring. If you can go to an auto parts store like AutoZone, just pick up RV grade silicone spray. That's the RV grade silicone spray. Most of the auto parts stores have 1 or 2 brands in there. Use that on your O-rings because they're going to last a lot longer. Much cleaner than the magic lube, and you can get a thorough covering of it really easily with the spray around. And the O-ring also lasts longer when you use silicone spray versus magic lube, in my opinion. So when you put the clamp back on and you have a drip leak, that's because the O-ring is worn out. And sometimes you can't even get the lid back on. It's worn out and it's kind of moving, and you can't get a clear seal with the lid. So carry some tank O-rings. What I like to do is buy several for my route if I have several different filters. And then I'll put it in a bag, a Ziploc bag, and I'll write with a Sharpie which filter it's for, because sometimes you get confused by these O-rings. So I make sure that I know exactly which ones are for which filter, and I'll mark it. I think in the video where I showed all my spare parts, I actually put a photo of the filter on the bag also and taped it on there. So it's easy to visualize it's a Pentair filter, and I grab it right away and I can put it on the filter. So have those O-rings and change them when necessary. You kind of know when you're trying to put the lid on, it doesn't go on there right, especially for the 2000 and 4000 series filter lids. But definitely have the spare ones on there so you can change the O-rings. And typically, when you change the O-ring, that stops the leak. The only exception would be the Hayward filter. Sometimes it's weird, but the Hayward filters, even with a new O-ring, is still leaking. And so what I've been able to do sometimes is take the old O-ring, put it back on, maybe turn the old O-ring inside out and lube it up really well, and that seems to stop it. But I seem to have problems with Hayward where you put the new O-ring on, it still has a little drip leak. I'm not sure what that is, but I found that I just put the old O-ring back on. Sometimes I just lube up the old O-ring with magic lube like crazy, or I'll turn it inside out, and that seems to solve the problem. And, hopefully by the time you need to replace it again, you can sell the customer a new filter. But yeah, that's the only one I've had trouble with was the Hayward. Most of the other ones fit on there, no problem. And you have some older filters you may run into, like an old Titan filter or old American product filter. Just make sure you have the O-ring for that on hand because they're not universal. Every O-ring's slightly different, but that's an easy fix. Just change the O-ring in most cases and that drip leak will stop. There's been a couple times where I've just let a slight drip leak go. I'll tighten the filter clamp just a little bit more, and then when I get back there the next week, it's not leaking anymore. But if it's leaking more than just a slight drip, like one drip every 30 seconds, then you definitely want to make sure you replace that O-ring. It's going to be a pretty steady drip, dripping every second, and you have a pretty big puddle underneath the filter quickly. That's when you know the O-ring needs to be changed at that point, when you have a pretty steady drip leak. Looking for other podcasts, you can find those by subscribing to my YouTube channel Monday through Friday. I'll post one there. Also go to my website, swimmingpoollearning.com. On the banner, there's a podcast icon. Click on that, and there'll be a drop-down menu with over 1,700 podcasts. And if you're interested in the coaching program that I offer, you can learn more at poolguycoaching.com. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Have a rest of your week, and God bless. This episode is brought to you by HASA, providing products that deliver clean, healthy water for every aspect of everyday life. The bottom feeder battery-powered vacuum system, portable, powerful, and only weighs 12 pounds. And Skimmer. Get Skimmer, America's #1 pool service software. Podcast listeners can try Skimmer for free at getskimmer.com/poolguy.